Well, good afternoon, everyone, and Secretary, thank you. I think everybody got a sense of the passion that you feel. So let me start at the beginning. You said you've been involved in this for 30 years. In the meantime, I think at the time your kids had to be 1, 3, 5, somewhere in that area?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so...
And one not yet born.
One not yet born. And so through raising your own children and now having, how many grandchildren?
6, soon to be 7.
So I'm about to say 6 and 1 more coming. And involvement in business interests, et cetera, you have pretty much wholeheartedly devoted your time to this. Why?
Because every child matters to me, and their futures and their possibility and their potential matter. And thinking back to the genesis of my involvement and both my husband Dick's and my involvement, you know, we knew from the time that our son Rick started kindergarten that we were going to be able to send our kids to any school that was going to be right for them. And we got involved with a small Christian school in the core of our city that was serving primarily low-income, multi-ethnic population, and the operating funds for which had to be raised privately, nearly all of them, because most of the parents could afford very little of the tuition. So we got involved on a very, you know, sort of high-level basis with supporting students at that school initially. And the more we got involved there, the more we realized that while we could help individual kids, it wasn't ultimately going to help every child. And just became convicted that we are perpetuating an injustice in our country here, and we need to do something to change that.
So you said this wasn't your first summit. What do you know now that you have a different role? You said it's not my first summit, but it's my first summit as the Secretary of Education. What do you know now that you didn't know when you were sitting in the seats over the last 9 years?
Well, obviously, I'm looking at it from a different perspective with a role in a federal agency. And one of the things that I have learned, I'm often asked, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned thus far in your role? And I knew that a federal bureaucracy was large and bureaucratic. I did not fully appreciate how bureaucratic it is and how difficult it is for simple things to get done and accomplished. We're committed to trying to change some of that internally there, but the key is to really stay focused on advancing, asking the question around everything we do is, how is this benefiting students and how is this adding value for students?
So now I get to ask the question that every governor wants to ask a secretary of the United States. Help us understand, in your mind, what's the right role for the federal government? What's the state government's role? We've had a lot of discussion on that, a lot of changes over the years. You know, in your mind, what's the right role for states like us to play, and then what role does the federal government play?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important for us to talk about the role of education, and we talk a lot about public education, but I think that we're at a time where we have to rethink how we define public education. And in my view, any school or any educational setting that actually benefits a student or students is to the benefit of the public. And we could better talk about public education being anything that helps students achieve their dreams, learn, and advance their futures. If we think of public education in a different way, I think that also helps us consider the proper role of the federal government versus the states. When we also consider the fact that 90% of the funding for education is really from within the states, the federal government's had an outsized role in recent time as it relates to the state. And I think that going forward, we will do much better if we continue to go along the path that the Every Student Succeeds Act has set in motion of really returning a lot of the flexibility to the states, a lot of the decision-making and the opportunity to really innovate, not only at the state level, but as I've encouraged states that have submitted their plans to really engage and empower their local school districts, and even the local school buildings to make the decisions that are right for the students they're serving there. So I believe the role of the federal government should be as light a footprint as possible, but supporting the things that are federally legislated around supporting special needs students and ensuring that students' rights are protected.
So let's stay with the ESSA. We're new, I mean, we're in the first year of it. I guess the first ESSA plans came to the department while you were secretary for approval. What are you seeing out of states? What are you seeing that you like? Any advice for governors? You have a lot of state legislators here. Any insight from taking those ESSA plans? And Governor Bush talked earlier, great states are just great copycats, which is true. We have not had an original idea yet. We've stolen everything we've had. So what have you seen in those plans that might be good for other states to hear that a particular state has proposed?
Well, just to put it in a little context, so in the spring, 17 states submitted the plans, and 16 of them have been approved. And then the balance of them, plus Puerto Rico's plan, came in the fall in September. So we're in the process of the reviews for those plans. Let me just say, for the ones that have been submitted that I've had opportunity to really have a closer review of and look at, there's wide variety in approaches to how individual states are proposing to look at things and meet the students' needs. And that's I think that's laudable, and I think we should see a wide variety. I think the challenge for states is going to be to look at their plans not as a ceiling, but as a floor, and to challenge themselves to continue to use the tools or use the flexibility that has been afforded in the ESSA legislation to really allow for a lot more creativity and innovation to rise up from within their states and from the local level. I would not call out any one thing as being particularly innovative or, I mean, there's lots of unique approaches, but I think that it will be up to a lot of the governors and state school officers, and frankly, others who can and should be engaged with the actual implementation of this, to look at what others are doing and challenge themselves more on how they can actually meet their students' needs at a higher level. And again, looking at the plans as more of not a ceiling, but a floor in that regard.
Let me make a general comment that I speak to a lot when I have a chance to speak to groups, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I would argue that we're at a critical time in education in the country, and you could argue, well, it's always that, but we're at a unique time for this way. If you think about it, we had 8 years of a Republican president, George W. Bush, who proposed No Child Left Behind, a fairly radical idea that says we think every child can learn regardless of zip code, regardless of income, race, anything else, and every child deserves to have a quality experience in school. And we're going to we're going to put some accountability on that. So that was a radical new approach. Then you had 8 years of a Democrat president who, I didn't agree with a lot he did, but he did something really critical. He said every school or every student is going to have a year-end assessment that's a quality assessment attached to what he or she has been taught. And then the teacher's evaluation is going to include how well that child progressed year over year. Okay, and so again, President Obama went against one of his biggest constituencies, the teachers union, and saying that that's their holy grail is to separate the assessment from the evaluation. He said, no, we're going to do that. Now we've passed the SSA, which really, in a lot of ways, doesn't totally, but puts the federal government in a whole different role, the one you were describing, which, you know, as a governor, I like that thought. But it puts a whole different level of, I think, pressure on the people in this room. It's no longer about what can we get the president to do, or what can we get the Secretary of Education to do, or even what can we get the governor to do. It's about what's our school board do, and what's our state legislature do. So that changes you talked about people who are activists. I think it changes it very much. I'd love to hear, do you agree with me we're at a different time in terms of education in the state? While those are good steps, and fundamentally I agree with them, there's some danger attached to that too. And what's that mean for 1,200 people in this room who care deeply about students getting a great education?
Absolutely, I think it has the potential to change the dynamic significantly, and I would argue will ultimately be to the good, because we've had top-down approaches for more than a couple of decades now, and it's been proven to not be effective. And so really enabling and encouraging creativity and innovation at a local level can help bubble up a lot of really effective solutions and outcomes for students. One of the things that I think is very promising, and I'm hopeful that a lot of states take a close look at it, if not states, certainly districts and school buildings themselves, and that is this notion that a child's learning experience should be much more driven by the child and much more personalized and customized. And I know that for many this is quite a departure from what has been the routine for many years. But we're losing too many kids because they're either bored to death sitting in their rows of desks after they've mastered the concepts that are being taught that particular day, or we're leaving kids behind because they're not catching it. And having an approach that will allow them to really move at their speed and will be outcomes and achievement based versus an assessment that's catching someone at this particular snapshot in time. I think that approach has far more promise, but I think it's going to best take root in school buildings and local districts rather than trying to have a larger entity mandate it.
Three more questions before we run out of time. One, you talked about PISA, the PISA exams, and how as a nation where we think of ourselves as being leaders in education, but we're at best in the middle of the pack when it comes to the industrialized world, at best. Mm-hmm. So what's happening? What can we learn from other countries? How does this nation that is the richest, most technologically advanced nation in the history of the world, how did we end up in the middle of the pack, and what can we learn from other countries?
Well, I think we are learning a lot from other countries in terms of how they allow for choices and options in children's education. And it's interesting to note that some of the highest performing countries as a country allow for a lot more choices and a lot more control on the part of the parents for where their kids go to school. So while there isn't a direct correlation between a high-performing country and choice there and ours, I think there are a lot of things that can be gleaned from studying those countries and how they empower parents and more empower local level than we've experienced in the recent decades.
Next question about, you've talked about, and I've seen you talk in other places about the changing world, not just technology, but that we used to always have this idea that every child needed to graduate from high school and go to a four-year school, and I've seen you talk about apprenticeships and technical schools and community colleges and the different roles. I'd love to hear just kind of what you've learned since you've been in this role, some new insight into how we as a country can think about education, post-secondary education beyond just a four-year school.
Well, I think one of the things that we've really done a disservice to young people with is to suggest that the only path to success is a four-year college or university. And I've said that frequently. I think we've subtly or not so subtly sent the message that to do something else was less than or lesser than, and I think that's very fallacious, and that we need to change our language, and we need to encourage young people to find the areas that most interest them. Yesterday, I visited Oakland High School in Murfreesboro, and it was so fascinating to see kids in 3 different programs that they had chosen based on aptitudes that they had worked through. They're doing aptitude testing now with all their incoming freshmen to help students understand, do I do I work well with my hands? Do I have 3D spatial reasoning and recognition? And what are some of my innate abilities, and how might I employ them? And we went into a health sciences room, and there were students learning some of the basic procedures for a variety of health applications. We were in an automotive repair facility, and then we were in a mechatronics lab. And all of the students were fully engaged with the learning they were doing there. And in speaking with them and asking them, how did you end up pursuing this track? They all said, because I found out that this is the kind of work, or this is the kind of opportunity that I would like to do and I would like to pursue. All of them are going to leave that high school, some of them with almost associate's degrees because of dual enrollment, and others with a very defined picture of what their future might look like in terms of education beyond high school, because of the opportunities that they are starting to have as early as 9th grade, but in many cases in middle school. So we have to start exposing young people to all of these different tracks, pathways, opportunities at a much earlier age, and being really intentional about partnering with our local community, businesses and industry to recognize what the opportunities are for that region in the coming years.
So let me ask you, I said 3, but I'm gonna cheat and get one more in here. When you were at that high school, you were about 20 miles away from, this is hard for you to hear as a Michigander, but the largest automobile plant in the history of the Americas.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just had to get a little plug in there. But if you went and talked to the folks who lead that, said, our world's changing. We're probably moving to a world of electric vehicles, autonomous driving vehicles, so our supplier network changes too. And it's putting the battery together is very different than building a combustion engine. And we're trying to decide who we're going to buy the sensors from. So the whole supply chain, which is so critical for any advanced manufacturing changes. I guess what I worry the most about, sometimes I think in all the education stuff, we're fighting yesterday's battles. Like you said, we have adults fighting over kids instead of for kids, I think was your line. When we really need, if we're really going to help them, we need to be thinking about, wow, those 8th graders, they're going to walk into a world when they enter the workforce that's, the demands are totally different. So how do we as educators start to think about that? How do we get ready for a world that's changing that fast? As I think Jeb talked this morning about, he used to brag about having an iPod, now he realizes iPods are long gone. A world that's changing that fast, automobile industry, whatever it is, how do we help our educators help students be ready?
Well, I think about 4 skill areas that I think everyone would agree are pretty important, but are often not really even part of the conversation when it comes to K-12 education. And that is, how are students going to learn to think critically? How are they going to work well with others, collaborate? In every other setting outside of the education world, you have to collaborate. And yet, that's not necessarily an intentional pursuit. I think more and more schools are addressing that now, but the third thing is to communicate well, both in writing and verbally. And I know that, thinking back to my grammar school days and how much I disliked grammar class, by the same token, today I think we've gone so far away from helping kids learn how to write well and how to communicate well in verbal manner. And those are critical skills to acquire for whatever role you have beyond K-12. And then finally, be able to think and act creatively. And my observation has been that in all too many cases, by the time kids get to 3rd to 5th grade, a lot of that creativity is pretty tamped down, unless it is an intentional environment that encourages and spawns creativity. So, I mean, those things, holistically, I think should be addressed in a way that fits in or is an essential part, a core of a K-12 mission.
Last quick question as our clock counts down. You said, you talked about people getting arrows in the back and in the front, and I don't know anybody that has maybe had to take as many arrows as you have from different people, and I've been there, and it's not fun. It's just not. I don't care who you are and or how tough your skin is. It's not fun. But what would you, and people love to characterize folks and say, well, she's this or he's that. What would you want the national media that has, hasn't always given you a fair characterization, what would you want them to know about why you're doing this and why you care so much?
I just innately believe in the value and worth of every individual, and it breaks my heart to see kids that don't have the opportunities that they should have to become everything that they can be. And I think it's an injustice that we have inflicted on our country, and it's, seeing and talking to kids like, well, Denisha, for several years now, and I had the opportunity to talk to Orlando, the young man who's a freshman at Embry-Riddle, hearing their stories and being so happy for them, but having my heart break for every one of them. There's thousands and thousands of others that are not having those kinds of opportunities. It just breaks my heart, and so I will continue to take slings and arrows to try to fight for them.
Well said. Thank you so much, Secretary.